critical conversations we've had through the course of our events. And I'd like to spend a little time reflecting on our key takeaways and learnings from them before we dive into today's session. Our first event, which focused on catalyzing a just transition for India, reinforced just how critical it is to ensure that no one is left behind as we transition to a low carbon economy. This claims renewed urgency in the aftermath of COP26, where justice and equity in climate conversations were thrust into the spotlight and countries pledged to phase down coal and end international financing for fossil fuels for the first time. India also pledged a net zero target for the first time and enhanced its short-term renewable energy targets. At the ICC, we hope to work closely to ensure that those engaged in India's high emission sectors, such as mining and transport, are included and protected as we work to achieve these targets, and that the benefits of energy transitions are shared equitably. Our next event on green recovery emphasized that our economic recovery from the pandemic cannot come at the cost of deprioritizing urgent climate action. We need to traverse the path of an equitable and green recovery that prioritizes co-benefits across jobs, growth, and sustainability. And we already have many of the solutions we need to embark on this recovery. At the event, we spoke about agroforestry, clean energy-based cold chains, and the decarbonization of small and medium enterprises as some of the solutions that are ready for investments from the funding community. The ICC is committed to bringing solutions that work at the intersection of our development and climate goals to our funder community. Our third event on building climate resilience, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water launched the Climate Vulnerability Index for India, supported by the ICC and Edelgive Foundation, as part of their larger ambition to build a climate risk atlas for India. We believe that what can be measured can be managed better, and the Climate Vulnerability Index offers a sector-wide, district-level vulnerability assessment that maps critical climate risks to help increase preparedness, build resilience for vulnerable communities, and secure our resources. This will continue to be a critical area of work for us at the ICC. Onto the nature theme for today's session. With KPMG as our session partner, this is a conversation that has become so crucial in light of India's 2017 net zero commitment at COP26 and our ratcheted up 2030 targets. We'll be talking about the tremendous potential of nature-based solutions to deliver multiple long-term co-benefits while addressing the climate crisis. Natural ecosystems are intertwined with our economies, our businesses, livelihoods, and overall well-being. And this is increasingly emphasized in climate conversations. However, despite the multiple benefits that nature-based solutions have to offer, there's a huge funding gap to mainstream and scale them up, according to UNEP's latest State of Finance for Nature report. Investments in nature-based solutions need to triple by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050 from the current level. Most of the existing funding for nature-based solutions comes from the public sector, so we also need to mobilize significant private sector finance and grant capital to scale up these solutions. We have a diverse panel of land use actors with us today from across philanthropy, finance, research, and implementation, because these solutions cannot be achieved by one single actor alone. And the collective strength of the ecosystem working together is indispensable in delivering nature-based solutions and outcomes. I'd now like to invite our moderator for this session, Dr. Rohini Chaturvedi, to welcome and introduce the panelists. Dr. Rohini Chaturvedi is a consultant in international development and environment with expertise in climate, land use, and tenure. She holds a master's in philosophy and PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Gates Scholar. She also has a sectoral MBA from the Indian Institute of Forest Management. Rohini has been associated with the ICC from the very beginning and is presently senior advisor on the land use program. Rohini, over to you.
Thank you, Shloka, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone, our participants as well as our panelists. Shloka, thank you for introducing us to the session and placing it in the larger context of the climate investment series that you've been organizing. Before we jump into the session, there are a few housekeeping announcements. I know many of us have been using Zoom, and please do not feel frustrated if you find that the chat function isn't working. It's been designed to do that, but you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use that throughout the session to send in your questions. We have a very able team from the ICC, Manavi, Ajita, and Adele, who are sifting through these questions, pulling them together into a set that we will pose to our panelists later. The second thing is, please feel free to send in your questions as they come to mind. You don't have to wait until a specific point. But remember that just before we jump into the Q&A, we will share with you a poll. So you will also see a poll button at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear your opinion on some very basic questions that we have before us. I will now quickly shift to introducing our panelists who are literally joining us from across the world. We have, of course, India here, but also Africa, Australia, and the US. And thank you so much to Carolyn and Seema for joining at ungodly hours. It's very, very much appreciated. So Tim, many of you will know Tim, who leads the Nature for Climate work at UN Environment. And he's the focal point for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 to 2030. Welcome, Tim. It's great to have you join us here from Nairobi. Next we have Nitin Pandit, who is the CEO of Atri and joining us from Bangalore. In the past, Nitin led WRI in India, and he's also worked with the World Resources Institute globally, setting up what was a priority initiatives program for them. Nitin has expertise in a range of fields, and we hope that we will be able to dip into his vast knowledge as we go on. We also have from Bangalore, Samir, who heads Rain Matter Foundation. And Samir worked for many years in the tech space before the magnetism of sustainability drew him here. And he's been creating businesses and communities around responsible tourism, more sustainable agroecological agriculture. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts, Samir, sorry. And we next have Seema Paul, who's joining us from California, and it's 5 a.m. her time. Thank you, Seema. She's the program director of Sequoia Climate Fund and is leading their work on India as well as their global initiative on land. Many of us will remember Seema from the foundational role that she played in setting up Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation here in India, and more recently, the TNC in India. Welcome, Seema. It's also a pleasure to introduce Sandeep Roy Chaudhary, who is the co-founder at VNV Advisory Services. This is a social enterprise that works with communities and climate change in South and Southeast Asia. And Sandeep also joins us from Bangalore. So there seems to be, there's something at play that I haven't figured out. I'm told that it's the weather and the water. And last but not the least, a very, very warm welcome to Carolyn. As Shloka mentioned, KPMG has been our knowledge partner for this session. Carolyn is from KPMG Australia. She's been at the forefront of social and sustainable finance and impact investing for over 20 years. Presently, she's leading KPMG's natural capital and biodiversity market engagement work. Very, very warm welcome to you, Carolyn. I know it's middle of the night for you, but thank you so much for joining us. I will very quickly sort of draw out this panel. We decided that we wanted this to be more of a conversation. So we will have a couple of rounds of questions directed to each of the speakers. I'd respect the speakers to sort of be mindful of time and look at 3 to 4 minutes each. And we will then also have a Q&A round where the questions have come in from participants. So starting with you, Tim, and I know that we had very diverse groups registering for this event. And I thought perhaps that we could start with something very basic. And that is, why does nature matter? And what is the urgency that's bringing all of us together in this space today, globally, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Rohini, and also thanks to the ICC for organizing this very interesting panel. Starting with your basic question, why does nature matter? Nature has always mattered. I think we have just recently discovered how much it matters, because we're coming now to what we call the planetary boundaries, one of which is biodiversity, and we're seeing the effects of a beginning collapse of the web of life. And this has very real consequences for people. One of them is called COVID-19, which is a zoonotic disease that was transferred, according to latest science, on a wildlife market in Wuhan from wildlife to humans. There are many other zoonotic diseases like Ebola, HIV/AIDS. So there is a clear correlation between the level of deforestation and the amount and spread of zoonotic diseases and vector-borne diseases like malaria. So we mess with nature, nature messes with us. And this is a very unfair fight in the long run, because nature is so much more powerful on this planet and has been around for 3.5 billion years. This is not a fight we can win. So we need to make peace with nature. That's very clear. That's the title of a report that UNEP launched in February together with the Secretary General. Our Secretary General at the UN is even more outspoken and says we have to stop our suicidal war with nature. I think it doesn't get any more clear than that. And I think he's a very good and powerful advocate for this cause. But why does this matter, especially now? Of course, we are at the beginning of a perfect storm of changes that we have triggered. And the most impactful of those is climate change. If we manage to bring together our responses to the climate crisis with our responses to the biodiversity crisis, then everybody wins. As you said in the beginning, there's so many, as Shloka said, there's so many co-benefits from nature beyond carbon for resilience, adaptation, water security, food security, jobs, clean air, that we don't even need climate as an incentive to invest more in nature, but now we have this big incentive. And that big incentive has just been reinforced by COP26, and it is clear that there will be more investments in nature. It's clear that those investments have to be done quickly and they have to be done well. We are seeing the emergence of a multi-billion-dollar carbon removal industry, and because nothing else works at this point in time, not carbon capture and storage, not geoengineering, nothing else works. Nature is the thing. It's tried and tested through billions of years of evolution. You don't get better R&D than that. Carbon capture and storage, all the pilots have not worked so far. So we have to use nature as a stopgap measure. It's very important that we don't see nature as a nature-based excuse, but as a nature-based solution. We cannot substitute deep decarbonization across the economy with investments in nature, but nature can give us some time that we urgently need to decarbonize our economies. And of course, let me finalize with a point about India. India plays a huge role in this as the most populous country on earth, the 7th of the world population, fastest growing demand for energy, at the same time, a mega diverse country, mega diverse in terms of biodiversity. So if we can figure this out in India, we can figure it out anywhere. Thanks, back over to you.
Thanks, Tim. So many environmental organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, and development organizations went into COP26 with a bucket list of things that needed to be done. And they were very keen that they see action. How do you think the COP results have responded to some of the concerns that were being raised, particularly in light of what you just said, that we need to think of nature as a solution and not as an excuse? What were the big takeaways? Over to you, Tim.
So at some point when the Leaders' Declaration on Forests came out, I did a word comparison because of what is in Sustainable Development Goal 15 Target 2 on deforestation and what was in the Leaders' Pledge. And they were almost the same. So in 2015, everybody had already agreed to do this. Are we really only at the point where we say in 2021, we agreed to do it again, but this time we really mean it. So there has to be a groundswell of popular demand for our politicians to hold them to their word. And that's one of the ideas of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which under the hashtag of Generation Restoration builds a popular movement that thousands, millions hopefully of people eventually will support and follow as a means to hold our leaders accountable, leaders in industry, leaders in government, because we have to move from agreeing what to do to doing what has been agreed. That's where we are lacking action. We have lots of ministerial declarations and declarations of all kinds, but we need a decade of action now. That is very urgent, and it's also our last chance. So we have no alternative.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And that sort of leads me to my question to Nitin, who was at the COP and in the thick of things there. Nitin, there was a lot of excitement as well as skepticism about what exactly do India's net zero commitment by 2070 really mean? What are the pathways that are going to get us there? And what is the role that you think NBS will play, not only in policy, but also in practice? Over to you.
Thanks, Rohini. Yes, indeed. I admit I was at COP26, and I'm in complete agreement with what Tim said about the need to hold people who make declarations accountable to their words. And I applaud the work that he and his team are doing in the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration for this. In terms of the net zero commitments, first thing is I think India did do something interesting in terms of at least committing to a target. There were some questions when we went in whether India would or not, and I think they did. 2070 was a slightly longer period based on India's state of development. And but at the same time, there was at least a commitment to start with. I believe there was a lot of belief that that a lot of the emission reductions would come from the industry and from the energy sector, primarily still focusing on mitigation and not as much on what Tim was saying, which would lead more about adaptation and sequestration. So I suspect that that there was a lot of dependence still on reducing emissions through that. But that sort of brings us to the question as to, what does that really mean? Because a lot of the pledges that have been made, including by some of the industries in India, have been related to efficiency improvements. One almost may look at some of those pledges and say that they ought to have been done for their own sake in the first place. After all, efficiency improvement should be there for an industry for its own sake. So in that sense, there was a feeling of skepticism about exactly whether there was really the additionality, the extra effort that is needed to get measures in place to really make quantifiable reductions. And in that space, I must say that that nature-based solutions did not figure terribly high in the net zero commitments that you could see. There was a lot of discussion on the floor for the first time in the COPs, the many COPs that we've all attended. I'm glad that there was some recognition that there is a connection between biodiversity and climate. It was official. There was a little more emphasis on adaptation this time and not only on mitigation, perhaps in the exasperation of the moment that we may not be able to reach our own targets. So I would say that that's sort of a quick view in terms of what net zero commitment was made by India and what it might mean.
Thank you, Nitin. And this is, the lack of focus on adaptation as well as, the perceived challenges around getting NBS solutions off the ground is something that we've been debating COP after COP, at least on the sidelines of the main event. And with, that's something that, Samir, you've talked about as well, especially in terms of climate justice and the need to sort of bring in, climate justice when we think about our sort of NDC commitments or any other domestic commitments that we might make. To what extent do you feel that in country, we are geared up, whether it's in our policy framework, regulatory framework, or programmatically, to deliver on climate commitments with a justice component assured? And I ask this largely because we have always at the policy level maintained that justice comes first, especially for communities that live on the margins. Over to you, Samir.
Thanks, Roni. I'm delighted this conversation is happening, first of all. And I was listening to Tim and Nitin, and I'm glad this is being at least raised internationally at a level where it was not being raised. It's unfortunate that we still have to worry about adaptation versus mitigation, nature-based versus technology-based, and not look at it in a very root cause way, which actually gets you to the issues you raised around justice. And it's not just a global north versus global south problem. It's more fundamental around how we look at resources, people's access to it is very much part of it. But it's a fundamental question around how we look at resources and how we we talk in terms of circular economies, but we do not think in terms of circular systems. So the science of it has been around for maybe a couple of decades, but in terms of economic systems, in terms of financial systems, in terms of political systems, we are way behind the curve, right? So I think what we're calling nature-based solutions is simple, plain logic. The way we have framed the problem for ourselves is, we're trying to address in a root cause way. When you look at it as a carbon problem or a temperature problem, these are very downstream symptoms, and these are outcomes of a whole bunch of, like Tim said, broken relationships with nature, right? And to establish those relationships, you have to have the custodians of these climatic systems, the ecological systems, also build their lives, economies around it, be in control of them. And this automatically means that it's a system that's a lot more just. And like I said, it's not just between the global north and the global south and so on and so forth. It's also Bangalore's relationship with a village 500 kilometers away. So I think there's a deep re-examination of our economic, financial systems that we've created on top of the ecology that need a very, very strong look at.
Thank you. And so as we do this, as we think about climate justice and as we think about India's climate commitments as well as finance, I was just sort of kind of wondering, Seema, what are the milestones that we need to keep in mind, or what are the milestones that we need to track both up to 2030 and then 2070 to inspire confidence amongst donors that we are on track and doing things right, and not in a way that Tim calls it an NBS excuse?
Thank you. Really appreciate the seminar and the questions. So I think in terms of milestones, they have been pretty clear for some time now. The milestones really need to be about people, biodiversity, and climate change. Everybody would want to ensure that people's lives are improved, and that taking an NBS focus really is not at the cost of the communities, but for the communities. The second thing is biodiversity, that the approaches we take in the context of climate change are also biodiversity friendly. We are not going after single species focus, but are thinking holistically, to the point that was earlier made about really thinking about the foundational issues that are causing this problem, our relationship to nature and our relationship to access to resources. And finally, I think it has to be, also measurable in terms of the impact that it's having on climate change. Interpreting your question slightly differently, I think it's also important that we actually achieve implementation. In the case of India, for example, we've had a sequestration target under our previous NDCs. I hope that the target will be retained and improved. But the previous target did not get to any implementation. And so I think just showing progress is going to be extremely critical for the community at large across the globe, that we actually are making progress.
Thank you, Seema. So we are in a situation where we acknowledge the co-benefits that NBS can generate, and we emphasize that we need to have a co-benefits approach. We realize that, climate justice and social justice must be, economic justice also for that matter, should be central to whatever we do. We need to implement at an accelerated pace and demonstrate clear progress. And yet we find, Sandeep, that very little climate finance is available to actually support us in this journey. Do you think that following COP26, or even the changing sort of not climate, but the environment that we're seeing, there will be greater investment in NBS? And where do you see some of the key opportunities and challenges? And when I talk about investment, it's not just dollars, but also to get to the impacts at the pace at which we want. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's quite a broad subject, the whole climate finance piece. But, I think I'm actually going to back that up a bit. I don't think finance is the problem, Rohini. For organizations like us, we represent like a cohort of about 100 NGOs at the grassroots trying to access finance. We get them from what Tim mentions as the newly formed carbon removal industry, but it's been around for a while, actually. And it's something that's quite result-based, and there is money around. I mean, we ourselves have mobilized over 90 million over the last 1 year in India alone, and we would probably triple that amount. But the thing is, for us, I think more importantly, where are the projects? And I think the private sector needs to, work more closely with the private donor-based sectors as well, because we believe that there is funding available. We don't get enough bankable projects. Just to back that up again, I think nature-based solutions is the starting point, are people, because there is no nature-based solution without people. And I think that's where we need to concentrate on, because a lot of degradation, et cetera, has happened because of over-dependence on the forest, given our population and density. So I think we need to first talk about the people. And I would actually, and I was just putting it up in social media as well. I mean, it's a way, let's stop calling them the vulnerable. Let's start calling them the first responders, because that's exactly what they are. And that way you change the power equation between a donor and a vulnerable versus somebody who's the first responder and has the right to ask for the tools and the capacity to deal with the climate crisis. And I think that's the starting point of all transaction that happens between people and donors, governments, private sector towards conserving and restoring nature to what it was. I actually, kudos to Tim to bring that up, that deforestation pledge. We were all at the COP and it just sounded the same thing of its old, what do you call it? Old wine in a new bottle. That's about it. So, I would rather not spend so much time on the commitments. I would spend time on what the private sector has to offer here. We have a lot of net zero targets flying around in the private sector as well. And that all these private sector companies will have residual emissions, which have to be accounted for. It's also part of climate justice in a way. While you decarbonize in the global north as companies, you will need to also spend as a responsibility towards the global south populations, who are, again, calling them first responders again. So I believe that there is enough funding available. It's about where Okay, public climate finance, maybe not, but private sector climate finance, there is enough funding around. It's just about finding the right projects to invest in and look at how long-term can these projects go and how do you blend different kinds of financial instruments, be it equity, debt, different kinds of grants, etc. You will need to blend it because that's the only way to get long-term. NBS projects are usually 15, 20 or 10 years. So to understand that space, you need some time. It's just not, you can't just bamboozle through either money or through anything else. There are people involved. We need to first understand them and then move backwards from there. So, Rohini.
Thank you, Sandeep. But I'm going to kind of put Carolyn in the hot seat for a minute because she's been at the forefront of these finance-related conversations globally. Carolyn, we understand that NBS is complex. We understand that people need to come first. And as Sandeep said, we need to understand people before we go and do something. But finance and financiers are often impatient. There is a little bit of patient capital available, but there is also a lot of impatience. Do you see, what are the trends that you're seeing in the global space vis-a-vis commitments to NBS investments? And are these the kind of investments that would make sense to those who are first responders, as Sandeep calls them, and the realities in which they operate? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Rohini. And hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join you. I'm very delighted that KPMG is collaborating with ICC as your knowledge and session partner today, and terrific to have such a broad and esteemed representation on the panel today. So, as Shloka mentioned, I think India has a very important window of opportunity to harness the role of finance more effectively, to incentivize and reward good environmental stewardship for farmers, but also achieve climate justice and to really meaningfully incorporate NBS into a systemic market-based framework in order to what I call it mainstream a nature positive economy. I think it's vital to do both. So wearing my capital finance hat, actually, for a minute, the overarching macro trend is that the economic case for nature is growing rapidly. If we look at global landmark initiatives like the Capitals Coalition or the Dasgupta Review, all signal the real paradigm shift which is underway in how we are redefining the value of nature as a precious asset. So natural capital actually is a way of thinking about nature in much the same way as traditional capital. If we invest in it, it creates value, and if we degrade it, we limit its value. And this in turn is actually poised to have a tremendous ripple effect on how nature is recognized and accounted for on balance sheets in a more integrated and holistic way of reporting, in a way that will actually internalize the externalities and make impacts and dependencies of organizations on nature visible to a much more broader stakeholder community. So recently, KPMG actually conducted a global survey of sustainability reporting, which involved over 5,200 companies across 52 countries. And this survey usually serves as a guide to investors, asset managers, and rating agencies who now factor ESG information into their assessment of corporate performance and risk. We've identified that only about a quarter of companies currently report on risks from biodiversity loss. And now, with the launch of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, which follows into the footsteps of the TCFD, like the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and seeks to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks. The stage is really set to support the much required shift in global financial flows away from negative activities and towards nature positive activities. So where does this leave us? Well, one could say that nature is now the grandest global asset management challenge and opportunity of our time. The first financing trend we're seeing is that the financial services sector is really asserting itself as a key lever to drive that change in the real economy through their lending, their underwriting, and investment allocation decisions. Nature is already being embraced by institutional asset managers as an explicit investment thematic, both in public and private debt and equity capital markets. For example, Prince Charles brought together a new natural capital investor alliance under the banner of his sustainable markets initiative to mobilize 10 billion US in natural capital investment opportunities. And the second inspirational global financing trend is really the rise of blended catalytic capital and accelerator funds to enhance the investment readiness of nature-based solutions. So typically, these kind of funds actually come as a blend of both public and private venture philanthropic and impact investments, and are often coupled with much needed technical assistance windows to support NBS projects in the early feasibility stages, right through to the commercial stage, or to baseline and measure the impact. These are filling a really critical financing gap as well, and play an important role in building the much needed pilot NBS projects and proof of concepts, which can then be staged and scaled. So I think Samir actually touched on this as well, that the hallmark of the catalytic capital is that it is patient, it is risk tolerant, it is concessionary with often unconventional terms, and therefore it can actually go where traditional private sector capital can't or won't yet go, and really de-risk the investment proposition for other more conventional investors. So for example, the UK government's Nature Investment Readiness Fund, or the recently launched Nature and Accelerator Fund by the IUCN, the Global Environment Fund, GEF, and Mirova, are some global use cases where this has been successfully applied to nurture those transformative and scalable and financially viable NBS projects. If we take the Nature and Accelerator Fund, that's leveraging an $8 million anchor investment by the GEF with the objective to actually develop a viable pipeline of NBS transactions to the tune of about 200 million. So if designed right, these are actually holding impact first for the first responders, and can be a real voice for greater social and climate equity, but also foster the innovation and collaboration across different sectors, across different actors in and across the NBS arena. So in my view, these really could be augmented for the Indian country context and assist in building the field of place-based, nature-based solutions in India. And lastly, I think, the third sort of trend which we're observing actually is coming from multinational corporates themselves, especially those with extensive supply chains and a strong dependence and impact on nature, like the food and agribusiness or the fast-moving consumer goods sector. So many corporates are already taking a proactive role to safeguard and enhance the long-term resilience of their own supply chains, engage small farm communities, or promote the cultivation of crops or raw materials with more sustainable land management techniques, and to drive the greater prosperity in rural areas. And what we're now seeing actually, is that corporates are launching their own in-house climate and nature funds, with investments really ranging anywhere from about 25 million to 1 billion US. So these corporate funds are becoming much larger in size and broader in scope of the conservation, but also the social impacts that they're targeting. And these are often underpinned by company-wide net zero and nature positive commitments. So some of these funds actually have financial returns and, also actually like generate high quality carbon credits with social economic co-benefits. Some others are purely grant based, and these are often implemented also in partnerships with global conservation NGOs and civil society organizations, which do bring decades of in-country standing power and expertise in really assessing and implementing nature-based projects.
Thank you, Carolyn. I understand that there are these very, very encouraging trends. And we've also spoken of the complexity on the ground. And Tim, I wanted to come back to you because you've been sort of interlocutor amongst all these different stakeholders, and you've been a participant in these conversations. What do you think are the expectations of India? What would both the science and the finance communities globally like to see to inspire confidence in India being able to deliver on NBS investments?
Thanks, Rohini. I agree with almost everything that everyone has said, but I would like to challenge a little bit this notion that nature is just an asset. You can also see people as just an asset. And I, for my part at least, would like to be more than just somebody's asset on a balance sheet. Thank you very much. And that's the same, that the way that most people view nature. It's not an asset. So if we speak only in economic terms about nature, I think we're undermining the long-term stability of this investment that we're making. And along the same lines, it's important to recall that economics is not a science. It's not like physics where there are natural laws. Economics is a social construct. And we can change the rules of that construct if we so choose. And I think that is the kind of change we need. It's not only to sort of shift the investments that we're making, it's a new economic paradigm. And maybe one of the most important books of this century, if we look back a few decades from now, is called Donut Economics, which you might have read by Kate Raworth, which suggests a completely new economic paradigm. And it's surprising when you go through the history of economic constructs, how much they're driven by the stories that we're told. Because economics is based on stories that we all buy into and that we all believe. And I think we have to go deeper in the way that we restructure our relationship with nature. We have to go much deeper than just seeing this as an asset class and investment opportunity. Although that is, of course, in the short term, that's important. And it's much better to invest in nature than to invest in its destruction. So I applaud that. But we have to, the transformational change has to go much deeper than that. And in that context, I wanted to flag here that one of our partners in the UN Decade called Common Land, which also has a project in Australia, by the way, and one in India. I'm personally a great fan of their 4 returns framework, because it's also an educational tool for investors to say, when you think about nature, you cannot think about only financial returns. You have to think about 4 returns. The inspirational return from the restoration you're doing, the social capital return by improving people's livelihood, the natural capital return by bringing back nature, and the financial return. But that should be your last consideration. And you should think long-term. This is a 20-year investment framework where you're asking donors up front, like Samir and also Sandeep mentioned, this is not a quick in, quick out opportunity to make some money. And if we give that impression to donors that this is the next hot asset class, they will be disappointed, because this is not how it is. This is complicated, it's complex. One person's degraded landscape is another person's livelihood. I mean, being here in Kenya, where there are conflicts over degraded landscapes and overgrazing, it is complex. And if you just say we build a fence around that and maximize the carbon, we take shortcuts that will come back to bite us. So please do look up the 10 principles for good ecosystem restoration, which FAO, UNEP, ICN, Society for Ecological Restoration posted at the ICN World Conservation Congress in September. And make that the basis for these kinds of investments. That is also at the basis of the Restoration Seed Capital Facility that UNEP runs, and we are recognizing definitely the need of a lack of bankable projects, Sandeep, and there is an effort called the Restoration Factory with Bridge for Billions, where we're trying to educate a whole generation of young ecopreneurs into this emerging economy of nature conservation and restoration. But that is a drop in the ocean. We need many more such efforts where we mentor young people coming into this field to make this their livelihood. Bankable projects, yes, that is a medium-term objective. But first of all, we need to bring people into this field of regenerative agriculture, of nature restoration, of conservation, into this new emerging economy.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I think you've voiced concerns that a lot of people have in the past and even today, and are voicing even today. And they are absolutely something that we need to attend to as we look at the ways in which finance is deployed and for what. But I want to pick on something that you said in your first comment about having a groundswell of action. And then again, you've mentioned now about the need to build, to bring more people into regenerative agriculture and other. And I wanted to sort of ask Nitin a question that links up with this. And I know, Nitin, you've been a very, very strong advocate about thinking on the demand side of things, and building the demand for whatever interventions we want, social, ecological, or both. How do we do this? What are some of the things that we can learn from in the past, and how do we leverage where we are already? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me pick up on a couple of things. I agree a fair amount with the concerns that Tim voiced just now about looking at everything where you try and make investment easier. That is, and I think we've heard this for a long time, where finance says we can't find good projects, and good projects say we can't find good finance. And so sometimes I think when you start looking at it from the demand side, the idea is, can you actually get finance where the finance has good uptake without adding sweeteners to it? Most of the time you find finance being offered, and then you offer subsidies on top of it and insurances on top of that. So which means, in effect, that the finance is not suitable for the projects. So I think projects looking for good finance is also a question. And then that brings us to, do we really understand demand? And if we do, then in that case, is there investment out there that would finance the kind of innovation that's needed to try and provide solutions for the demand that exists out there? Carolyn mentioned one of the investments that are coming in to finance innovations in that space. I think those are the kinds of things that are needed. And why? Because there is a perception out there that we are dealing with something that is complex, and so complex that we've never encountered it before. I think that's a myth. The amount of investment that has gone into the R&D, where one of the industries in India has said that towards the net zero commitment, that they will be sourcing 2 million barrels, let's say, of the world's first carbon neutral oil. Now, whatever that means, but the fact is that I can bet you a fair amount of research and work went into actually trying to get it from point A to point B. And I submit that that is just as complex, or perhaps even more complex, than what actually nature offers us. It actually offers us wonderful and simple and place-based solutions, which actually can be financed. But it needs us to, as Tim said, think out of the economic paradigm where we try and find cookie cutters everywhere for everything. So I think when you start looking at the demand side and understanding demand, I trust that actually industries will come up with amazing innovations to meet that demand. But if one tries to sort of wag the dog from its tail and ask the industry to try and change demand towards nature-based solutions, that's quite a stretch. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Nitin. Building on that, Seema, I was just thinking, building on that, Samir, how do you think how we can bridge this gap between demand and supply, whether it's in terms of finance or we think of it in terms of the outcomes we want? How do we do that? And what are the kinds of actions that we need to ensure that we have the scale and the pace to get to 2030 and beyond?
I truly wish I could answer that very, very confidently. It is a complex problem because there are many dimensions to it in the sense of the aspirations that we have exported across the hinterland in terms of the models, the economic models, the production models that we have made mainstream and deeply entrenched. Place-based solutions are absolutely necessary, and they are your, depending on your own ecological wealth, depending on, we came across this very interesting case where we were trying to understand if a 10 village cluster is a deficit economy, and it didn't take too much time to arrive at that answer. Like most of India is a deficit economy, except for a few powerhouses, economic powerhouses. And so there's transfer of wealth, there's transfer of, there's loss to the ecology, but there's also loss to large sets of people through this transfer. So place-based solutions actually offer a beautiful way out of this. And I don't know if we can tinker at the edges and get to this. I don't know if we can leave it to industry today. I don't know if we can leave it to business as usual, look for efficiencies at the edges of the problem and do this. I think if we look at it systemically, if we find intersections where economic justice, ecological regeneration go hand in hand, if we create great examples of place-based solutions, not in a way that where we do more pilots and more POCs, but in ways which are the mainstream, which actually create ecosystems around these solutions, rather than well-funded. You can fund your way into believing that you have arrived at a solution. But we came across this interesting phrase that India is a graveyard of pilots, and I don't think we have time for any more pilots. We have 6 to 8 years to turn this ship around, and if we don't arrive at answers quickly enough, I think we would have lost the war by and large. So there are a whole bunch of solutions out there. There's great examples. We have lots of social capital on one side, and we have a whole bunch of solutions on the other side. What we need is efforts that now start to take this to the mainstream, right? It is a complex problem. The aspirations, the focus of the government, the deep investments made into industry, etc., are all roadblocks to this process, right? But we have to find a way through all of this. And the huge opportunity is that a lot of people have lost in the current economic and production systems, and we are seeing massive ecological loss and losses and the outcomes of that. So the intersection between these two is probably where the answers lie, probably where we need to create very strong, rapid demonstrations of value and ecological reclamation. So I'm hoping we'll be able to push for that, do that at some scale, and see a groundswell in adoption of these models.
Thank you, Samir. And we understand the intersections. We understand, the need to be local. But then we've also got, huge expectations, and this supply side challenge of being able to absorb a lot of money very quickly and deliver the kind, very sort of tangible, precise, easily measurable outcomes. Now, somewhere I feel that philanthropy can play a very strong role in making all of these sort of disparate, fragmented pieces come together and bring communities together. And Seema, you have experience from the field and on the ground, and you have experience now and before on the donor side. How do you feel philanthropies can navigate the space at the pace at which we need change to happen? Over to you, Seema.
So I guess the first thing I want to say is that there is a broader discourse that needs to happen within the climate community, and that includes philanthropies as well. This whole discussion that we are having, we have the nature walas here. I think other than Nitin and myself, I think, and Shloka, most of the people here have worked on the nature side. And then there is the energy side of the climate challenge. The two communities don't speak to each other. They think differently, they think in separate boxes, and they are not coming together in the way that the coming together needs to happen. There is a lot of skepticism amongst the energy, focused climate camp about all that we are discussing here. One of the bigger, suspicions that they have about the nature-based solutions is how they will get misused by the industry. And this has been referenced before, but I'm making it a little more explicit. How they will be misused by the industry to continue business as usual. A few of us have even said that we want more engagement from industries. They should come in. But I want us to recognize that there is a lot of skepticism around industry's engagement, that they will use it to continue to do business as usual. An example of that is the fossil fuel industry. They want to do offsets because it allows their business to continue. That business will need to shut down in the interest of the planet. There are boundaries that we are, surpassing, that we have to rein in ourselves from. And so unless we bridge this chasm between the two communities within the climate camp, I don't even think that we can begin to really scale up our work in the ways that we need to. So I'd start with that. And an example of what that then means is that all our climate modeling does the modeling for energy on one side and for nature on the other side. The models are not even bringing the two things together. It's just a symptom of the bigger problem that I referenced. So I think that we have to first have internal conversations and bridge this challenge that we have within our community. And beyond that, what can philanthropy do? I would say that there are a lot of methodological concerns around measurement of nature-based solutions, and they need to be resolved. They are also a reason why, the energy-focused climate walas don't trust the nature-based solutions. There is a policy implementation challenge. A lot of pledges are made, no implementation happens. How do we make implementation happen in this space at the speed and scale that it needs to? People have referenced how this is the decade of action. We don't have many years left within this decade. So I think that's where philanthropy has to focus, but it has very limited dollars or rupees to bring to the challenge. It has to be very creative in how it designs its intervention so that it leads to speed and scale in action. And then, one small thing would be just making doing appropriate, I know advocacy is not a preferred word in Indian context today. I don't know. I don't have another word. I think there needs to be very strong advocacy around ensuring that the revised NTCs will have a sequestration goal, a goal around nature. It is all tied to our heritage. I find it ironic that our country, with its, deep and long heritage on nature, a country that came up with this phrase millennia ago about the planet is one, the nature is one, and we are all a family. It has this sort of a relationship with nature. And in adjoining China, they are building an ecological civilization. They're actually working very hard towards it. I think we have to put our money where our mouth is. I'll just stop at that. It was a broad answer, but I think the solutions are broader than philanthropy, but philanthropy can only be a catalyst. Thanks.
Thank you, Seema. One of the chasms that also exists is between the climate community and people who want to make climate investments and those who are on the development side and development finance. Sandeep, how do we get everyone together, especially when we're thinking about nature-based solutions that have such strong elements of both climate sequestration, but also, development?
I think the both of them are together in this. Actually, if you talk about NBS, you can't take away the development angle to it. And this is what I tell our teams as well. Look at the project from the development perspective, look at the livelihoods, gender, et cetera, and then look at what the derivative, the environmental derivative or the attribute, as we call it, is, and then try and marry the two each other in terms of the funding arrangement. Which is where, the ecosystem-based payment services, they kind of derive itself from the finances that is required on the ground to make the project work, not just now, for the next 20 years and make it permanent. I think everybody has to see it from that lens. If you're talking about nature-based as just carbon removal, then we have a problem in our hands. Because, and we get that sometimes, by the way, huh? We get these corporates who come to us and say, guys, we have this kitty. What are you going to do? Is that we make this amazing project design, and then they say, we could just buy some land and plant some trees then. If that's the way so that's a dangerous trend, and I see that happening in some countries that we operate in as well. So for me, I think it's really important to keep that development angle first. It's again, people first, and then you work backwards on, and that's how we look at it, at least. And I think to broaden the discussion a little bit, I think it's not as complex as people are making it out to be. There are different buckets of type of implementing projects within nature-based. You have at the ag space, you have the afforestation space, you have the REDD+ space, you have the ecosystem, the conservation space, you have different kinds. So you can't obviously bucket them all together because all of the finances are very different. Which then brings me to your question earlier to Seema, I think, about philanthropy. I think it can do magic. And there are live cases that we've seen in India, where a simple thing as just first loss guarantee or a partial risk guarantee kind of a thing can really accelerate other forms of capital to then take force, where, or just reduce the credit interest rate. And we've done that from a 14% to an 11% suddenly, and that's just a 3% interest differential. So it doesn't really matter what kitty you come with. It's actually of use, I think, especially, and going back to your question about development, because that's, I think, paramount here. We can't keep nature as just a climate solution. We have to look at this as a climate justice solution for people. And in the derivative of it, we will get the climate derivatives. And that's how you will fund programs. That's how we look at it. And that's how I think it's easier to bucket them. Because public finance, a lot of times does not reach the ground level. And that's where I think private sector does come in. That's where civil society comes in. That's where donors come in. But the public finance, and then you can easily bucket it out. Actually, in India, if you look at it, a lot of forest department land, national parks, etc. Break them down. Then you have the wetlands. Then you have the desert lands, etc. You can always break them out and have different forms of fragmented finance, looking at all of these in a more consolidated manner. And I think that's why we should not be looking at this such a complex problem, but people first. Development first. That's the first goal. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Carolyn, do you feel that the kinds of COVID recovery programs that are being developed and designed have the potential to bring some of these fragmented pieces together and sort of build that bigger pool?
Yeah, look, I think if we look at, you know, nature and the sort of economic recovery it can play in terms of, you know, the economic recovery post COVID-19. I mean, clearly, I think, you know, it's nature is, you know, as Tim mentioned, you know, it is actually like, you know, an engine of economic growth. But if it continues to be degraded, it will adversely affect human well-being, even if growth as measured in our current economic terms by the gross domestic product continues to rise. So I think if you look at, you know, even just agriculture and forests in India, together, I think they occupy about close to 70% of India's total land and support the livelihood of about 700 million people. And a high proportion of those people actually are tribal people who are, you know, the first responders and are often the poorest and most vulnerable sections of the society. So if we look at nature-based solutions as a very holistic form of addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, but also climate justice and creating good jobs. So nature-based solutions actually can play a very important role in terms of the economic recovery and really actually, like, you know, could help farmers, you know, and forest dependent communities adapt and even ensure that the food production is more resilient to future weather extremes like droughts, heavy storms or coastal flooding by enhancing the soil health or water retention or reducing, you know, the soil erosion or buffering the shorelines. So I think it has an important role to play, even if we actually, like, you know, just look at the actual new economies, you know, it could also actually catalyze. So yeah, I would leave it at this, you know, and to help you guide the discussion. I think you're probably, like, you know, other experts, you know, on the panel who would have other views to add.
Thank you. I'm not going to try and summarize, you know, the responses that we've had so far and the discussion that we've had so far. But instead, I'm going to open the slide for our audience so that they can come in. As I mentioned, we have a poll going with 3 questions. Let's see how our audience feels about them. May we have the poll, please? The first sort of question is around priority outcomes that we will be looking for with NBS in India. I can't see any results. Sorry. To the audience, please do poll. There's a little sort of icon at the bottom of your screen next to the Q&A. Unfortunately, panelists, we don't get to have a say. This is only for the audience. Okay. The second sort of question is around whether our audience thinks that NBS are a viable climate strategy for India. And the third, of course, is around, you know, whether they feel, what are the impediments that they think might nature-based projects face, and we are encouraging them to sort of draw from their own work and experience. Of course, these could be essay-type answers, but they're actually MCQs, so we've limited some of the responses and still waiting on the results. Perfect. And the results are right here. Well, I'm really glad that 95% of us feel that NBS is a viable climate strategy. It might also speak to the nature of the audience that we have. I'd love to do this at the International Land and Development Conference that's going on as we speak, and see what results come from there. It's also interesting that sort of we do want to see climate and biodiversity outcomes together, but poverty alleviation, though important, falls slightly behind. And then, of course, in terms of the impediments, there's a whole host that's vying for first place. So I'm not even going to try and get into them. But of course, we've got some fairly obvious responses. I'm going to close this and go into Q&A. So what's happened so far, panelists, is that audience has been sort of posting questions, and we've received a whole host of very amazing questions that our team has put together, clustered, paraphrased. We have time just for maybe a couple. So apologies, audience, but we'll try and address the others later. As you know, the first one, of course, is what would be the criteria for a good NBS project from a finance or funders' point of view? And Sandeep, this is to you. What do you think would be a good NBS project?
You're putting me in the spot here. Yes, of course. I think, look, there are a couple of things. One is community engagement and acceptance. The FPIC, so-called FPIC, we call it, and the stakeholder engagement process in India is really a sham. You know, so a proper stakeholder engagement is very, very important to be seen on the ground, and the community acceptance on that. And secondly, in NBS, we have this whole concept of benefit sharing mechanisms in terms of how are the benefits being shared with the communities at ground level, whether it be federations, whether it be farmer producer groups, or what is the exact institutional setup. That is almost something that's missing. And we spend a lot of time getting those in order, actually. And if that's in order, that's a good part. And also then the legal tenure part of it. You know, nature-based solution is not just about planting trees 1 year and going away from there. You know, it's about being there, invested with the community for a while. So I think tenures, contracts, you know, because some of these contracts will span generations. You know, a 2-year-old today in your meeting in 15 years' time is a 17-year-old who might not have agreed with what his father or mother might have signed up on. So these are things that are really important to keep in mind to have a good project on the ground. So I am not so, concerned about the capacity of the communities in developing. That's fine. We understand that there is no capacity. People will work. That's where, again, your philanthropy might come in. But a good project is something that they have very clear legal titles, proper rights management, proper stakeholder consultations. That's what we are missing. Everybody's running after the money, but this is where the de-risking of a project happens. You know, and this is where permanence is involved. So yes, you will spend a lot more money up front, but so be it, you get a better project on the ground. So that would be my few points on that. Yeah.
Seema, is there something that you'd like to add?
Oh, I agree with what has been said. That does make a ton of sense. But I think from I've worked on biodiversity and I've also worked on climate change. Taking a climate perspective, I think it will be very important to resolve the methodological issues of measurement. And of course, people have to come first, no doubt about that. And, you know, whichever camp you're in, whether your development is a co-benefit or development is your primary objective, I think the environmental angle is always there, right? So I think it's important that the projects have clear methodologies in place to show the benefit on both counts, on the development count as well as on the side of climate. And that measurement and evaluation will be strong on those criteria.
Thank you, Seema. The other question is around evidence and trade-offs. And I think basically, given the increased emphasis on the agri space and NBS on agricultural lands, croplands, there's a concern that climate might end up competing with food security, nutritional security, as well as India's target of doubling farmers' incomes. Nitin, do you think this is a valid concern given where we are today? And how do we actually address this either way?
Well, thank you for that question. It can be a concern depending on the context, so that it's an it depends kind of an answer. However, I think there are innovations possible in this space. For example, India has a substantial amount of degraded land which is essentially out of service. And whereas previous schemes, whether it was the Wasteland Development Scheme many years ago, the Watershed Development Program some years ago, and so on, where a whole bunch of us and the industry and investors came in and offered solutions to farmers that you will do this, or you should do this, or try this, or try that. Pump more water, restore your soil, don't do any tillage, don't burn your crops, whatever. And these were all solutions that were brought in from the supply side and that the farmer was supposed to take up at the farmer's risk, because it was all oriented towards their productive lands. And that's where trade-offs occurred. Now, if in fact you focus on what we are trying to do in the ARREST program, which is what we featured in the COP, where if you focus on what is a substantial amount of degraded land in India, and just in peninsular India, at a very conservative level, we've got 13 million hectares that we are targeting. So there, the narrative is very different, because when we went to the ground and asked farmers as to what they wanted first, and characterized the demand, here the idea came out that in fact, pretty much all of them said that if we could put their degraded lands back in service, then in that case, that's a demand that we would characterize and where they would accept finance and suggestions quite readily. So you see, I think the answer is not in terms of trade-offs, which we know occur if we are trying to convince them to change their behavior on what is productive in their viewpoint. But innovations can be there if you try and convince them, where you tap in the demand that actually exists on the ground and see if you can act accordingly. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Nitin. I've just been reminded of time in big, bold letters in the chat box. So I'm afraid our audience Q&A segment is going to come to a close now. I would, however, invite our panelists to share just a couple of closing thoughts under 1 minute, please, if you can. And focused on how the role that you see for a collaborative like the ICC in addressing these complexities, in bringing in the finance, in making sure that finance is deployed in ways that meet our development and justice concerns. I will begin with you, Tim. Just a couple of closing remarks, please.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to make my closing remarks about the role of the Indian government, who's taking over the G20 presidency in 2023. G20 is responsible for 80% of all emissions. So this is the club that has to make it happen, sort of. And in that context, India has a key role to play to lead on reforming fiscal incentives. And I think the work that has been done in India with shifting fiscal incentives from forest degradation to forest conservation, the work in Andhra Pradesh where fiscal incentives for chemical fertilizers were replaced and saved, in fact, for the taxpayer with zero budget natural farming, which increases farmers' input. So all of these things which increases farmer salaries, all of these things can be brought to a global stage at the Indian G20 presidency. But one thing that needs further work definitely is how much money of the recovery trillions that are programmed, about $16 trillion globally. How much of that goes into climate finance and how much of that goes into nature? There's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's only about 18% of that that can be considered in some way as green. Only 3% of that goes into nature. So we can do much better with that $16 trillion that are being programmed at the moment.
Thank you so much, Tim. And over to you, Samir. Any closing remarks, especially on the role of the ICC?
Yeah, we've actually been having conversations with the ICC on a lot of things that we need to do as a collaborator. So I think just segueing from the last question raised, there is no bigger risk to food security or the economy than climate change, and we've already seen instances of that this year. So it's not at odds with the solutions actually. The level of risk that this poses to very, very existential realities is starting to show up, and it's not funny. We have to start to understand this systemically. It's a complex problem because both the negatives that have happened and the positives that will accrue from nature-based solutions, etc., exist at the intersections of these things. 80% of Telangana's energy goes into agriculture. So there's your energy problem solved right there. So we have to start understanding these intersections and create a consensus around it. The climate funding has to acknowledge the complexity of it. It cannot be siloed. I actually do not agree with the idea that we can break it down into little boxes and just fund that. Your solutions have to acknowledge the complexity, and you could participate in a part of it. So we have to arrive at a consensus on what these vectors are, what these directions are, what these intersections are, make that the hero of this solution space. And the sooner we do it, the sooner what we really need to fund is the accelerated adoption of these things. If we do not do it fast enough, I fear that more of what happened this year in terms of crop losses, in terms of flooding, etc., will force our hand. Will force us to find place-based solutions because there are no long supply chains left. So
Thank you.
Our funding needs to go in there really. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samir. Seema, any parting thoughts? Very quickly, please.
Yeah, agree with everything that has been said by the previous panelists. I would just reinforce ICC's name, which is collaborative. I think it should really continue to promote that. There is a strong need for people to come together, for organizations to come together and work collaboratively. Whether they are in the philanthropic space, they all need to work collaboratively so that the solutions are robust and scalable. And in the NGO space, it's really hard to find good collaborations and a willingness to be truly collaborative. The problem may be starting from the funder side because every NGO is competing for funds. But unless we collaborate, we are not going to be able to solve this challenge in this decade that really matters. So live up to your name, continue to do the good work that you're doing.
Thank you, Seema. And Sandeep, over to you.
Yeah, I think, the name says it all, collaborative. I think that's important. I think we all in this space doing our own thing. And it is an all hands on deck, isn't it? So I think, if everybody can put all those hands together somewhere, because we're doing our own thing, really. So I think there is a big part to play for a collaborative here, which brings in different parts. And because we don't need to compete, each solution does not need to compete with another climate solution. I think everything can coexist, and in fact, needs to coexist. And I think that's where it should head from here on. We should disagree, but we should all understand and acknowledge the fact that the end game is the same for all of us. So yeah, I'll leave it to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep. Carolyn?
Yeah, thanks, Rohini. So look, reflecting on our discussions today, it really highlighted to me that the public, private and civil society's roles, responsibilities, but also increasingly objectives are converging. And the binding glue of the financial system is a powerful lever to achieve the scaling of nature-based solution, but it is only a means to an end and not the end in itself. At the end of the day, if we look at nature-based solutions can only scale if investable and financially viable projects can be implemented with the required integrity and veracity. And we also discussed, that none of those individual actors across the ecosystem can achieve this on their own. And I wholeheartedly agree with Seema and, Sandeep. I think it actually really needs, the collective. It also requires a very strong systems approach. And it's just amazing to see the impact an organization like ICC has had and how it could be leveraging its platform even more by acting as a field builder or systems convener to coordinate and support this strong, transparent and inclusive network of various NBS actors, and through that actually nurture and cultivate this virtuous circle of meaningful partnerships right across the NBS arena. So I think I would probably leave it there, but yeah, thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And Nitin, over to you for the last words of wisdom.
Wow, okay. I get to walk away with all of this. But look, a quick thing, the idea of collaboration that Seema and Sandeep and Carolyn talked about, and it's in the name, so it's important. I think Seema's challenge is correct. Live up to that name, that's critical. Samir mentioned something about intersections, because we operate in silos, and especially in the government. And I feel that the ICC has a very, very important role. And I'll go back to the word that Seema hesitatingly used in the beginning, advocacy. There is a need for advocacy for nature-based solutions in the government so that these silos can be crossed. They are an impediment, they're a pain in the ass, and that's what it is, and I'll call it what it is. So please help everyone out by promoting and advocating nature-based solutions, and I think we may have some hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin, and we can always rely on you to call it what it is. I'd like to end today's conversation with two things. One is a huge thanks to our audience. Nearly over 160 people joined this call. Thank you so much for being here, and to our panelists for sharing your thoughts and reflections. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. I would finally also like to announce that with our knowledge partner, KPMG, we're putting together a playbook, a knowledge product that is the first of its kind in India, focused on how we can bring finance to NBS in ways that addresses the complexity and responds to the complexity, internalizes the complexity. So do look for this. It will be up on the ICC website. And if you would like to sort of stay in touch, we will be sending around details of how you can sign up for our newsletter, etc. And there will be an announcement of the knowledge product there too. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to the tech team that's taken care of all of this and ensure that it runs seamlessly for all of us. Thank you.